The morning Elias Colt rode into Dusthaven, New Mexico, the saloon was displaying its girls like prize horses at a summer fair, and not a single one of them noticed the dusty, scarred young woman sweeping the back corner like she was trying to disappear into the floorboards. Dusthaven sat roughly 40 miles southeast of Santa Fe, a town that had clawed its existence out of red clay and desperation sometime around 1871, and by the spring of 1878, it had grown into something almost respectable: 2 dry goods stores, a livery, a sheriff's office that leaned slightly to the left, a church that nobody much attended, and the Copper Bell Saloon, which everybody attended far too often. The desert heat came early that year, baking the wooden boardwalks until they cracked and sending dust devils spinning lazy circles down the main street like they had nowhere better to be. The mountains to the north, the Sangre de Cristos, were still snow-capped and indifferent to the suffering of the flatlands below. It was the kind of town where people either passed through or got stuck, and very few ever chose it deliberately. Elias had not chosen it deliberately. His horse, a big steel-gray stallion named Cinder, had thrown a shoe somewhere outside of Galisteo, and the nearest blacksmith was Dusthaven, and so Dusthaven it was. He rode in slow, one hand resting easy on his thigh, his dark eyes scanning the street from beneath the brim of a weathered hat that had seen better decades. He was 28 years old and built like the land itself, broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest, with forearms that bunched and flexed under sun-darkened skin when he reached down to pat Cinder's neck. His hair was dark brown and too long, curling slightly at the collar of his shirt in a way that suggested he had not sat still long enough for a barber in quite some time. There was a scar along his jaw from a run-in with a cougar up near the Colorado territory, and his hands were rough in the way that only came from years of honest grinding work. He was not a handsome man in the fine-boned, well-dressed way of men who sat behind desks. He was handsome the way a mountain was handsome, something raw and real and worth looking at for a long time. He left Cinder at the livery with a boy named Thomas, who promised to have the shoe replaced before sundown. And then, because he had nothing else to do, and the heat was already pressing down on the town like a heavy hand, he walked toward the Copper Bell. He needed water. He needed shade. He might even need something stronger, depending on how the day continued to go. The saloon's double doors swung inward, and the smell of sawdust and whiskey and cheap perfume hit him all at once. His eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior, and he took in the room in the way a man takes in a room when he has spent years in places where reading it quickly matters. Bar along the left wall, mirror behind it cloudy with age. Piano in the far right corner, not being played. 4 tables occupied by men with cards or bottles or both. And along the center of the room, arranged with the deliberate care of a shopkeeper arranging a window display, 4 young women in saloon dresses in various shades of red and gold, laughing and leaning and doing precisely what they were paid to be seen doing. And behind them, in the corner, half hidden by a post in the long shadow it threw, a woman on her knees scrubbing the floor with a brush, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone, her dress a plain gray cotton that was patched at both elbows. She was not scrubbing at the edges of the room the way someone cleans when they want to finish quickly. She was scrubbing with a focused, methodical intensity, as though the floor had personally offended her and she was determined to win. He noticed her. He noticed her in the way you notice something that is real in a room full of performance. He sat down at the bar and ordered water, which made the bartender, a heavy-set man named Floyd, squint at him with mild suspicion before pouring it. "Passing through?" Floyd asked. "Horse through a shoe," Elias said. "Waiting on the livery. Could be worse places to wait." Elias looked around the room again. The 4 women in their bright dresses had noticed him the way women in saloons always noticed a new man, with a kind of collective professional attentiveness. One of them, a tall blonde with a practiced smile, had already begun moving in his direction. He watched her come without particular interest, which was not because he was unfriendly, but because his eyes kept drifting back to the corner. The woman scrubbing the floor had paused. She was sitting back on her heels, pressing the back of her wrist against her forehead, and in that moment of stillness he could see her more clearly. She was not old, maybe 22 or 23. Her face was strong-featured in a way that the word plain did not quite cover, and the word pretty did not quite reach either. A wide jaw, a straight nose, dark eyebrows, set low over eyes that were, from this distance, some shade of brown or amber. He could not tell. There was a bruise fading at her cheekbone, yellow-green with age, the kind that had been there long enough to be going away but not long enough to be gone. Her mouth was set in a line that was not unhappy, exactly, but that had clearly forgotten what it felt like not to be braced for something. The blonde reached the bar and leaned against it beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. "New in town?" she said, and her voice was warm and practiced. "Just waiting on my horse," he said, politely enough. "Ma'am," she introduced herself as Clara, and she was genuinely lovely, with blue eyes and good humor, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what she had to offer. Under different circumstances, Elias might have talked to her for a while, but his eyes had gone back to the corner because the woman with the braid had dropped her brush, and when she bent to pick it up, a man at one of the nearby tables, wide, red-faced, with a drinker's unsteady quality, shoved her with his boot. Not a kick, exactly, more of a dismissive push, the kind you give a dog that has wandered too close to the table. She stumbled sideways and caught the post to keep from going down, and the man did not even look at her. Something went hard and still inside Elias's chest. "Who is that?" he asked Floyd, low, nodding toward the corner. Floyd glanced over his shoulder. "That's Nora. She works here, cleaning and the like." He lowered his voice a little, though there was nothing conspiratorial in his tone, just matter of fact. "Not one of the girls. She does the work the girls don't want to do. Came in about 6 months back, had nowhere else to go. Holt, that's the owner. He keeps her on because she works hard and doesn't ask for much." "That man shoved her," Elias said. Floyd looked at him with mild surprise, as though this were an odd thing to remark upon. "That's Denny Pruitt. He does that. She doesn't complain about it." "Whether she complains about it doesn't mean it's right," Elias said. Floyd gave him a long look, then went back to polishing his glass. Elias sat there for a moment longer, and then he picked up his water glass and walked across the room. Clara watched him go with an expression that shifted from surprise to something more thoughtful. The other girls watched too. Most of the men didn't notice at all. Nora was back on her knees with the brush by the time he reached her, and she startled when she realized someone had stopped beside her, flinching slightly in a way that made his jaw tighten. She looked up, and he looked down, and he saw that her eyes were amber, a light warm brown shot through with gold, and that there was intelligence in them, and a wariness that had been put there one day at a time over a long period of time. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." She stared at him. It was clear from the quality of that stare that this was not a sentence she heard frequently. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, a little rough around the edges, like she had not used it much that day. "That man pushed you," he said. "Men do a lot of things," she said. He crouched down, which brought him to her level, which was either an awkward or a purposeful thing to do, and she looked at him like she was trying to figure out which. "I'm Elias," he said. "My horse threw a shoe. I'm just in town until the livery's done." She held the brush in both hands and looked at him steadily. "Nora," she said. "Nora," he repeated like he was making sure it would stick. "Is there anything you need? From across the room?" Her mouth did something complicated. It was not a smile yet, but it was the beginning of one, and she seemed to catch it and pull it back. "I don't need anything." "All right," he said, and stood up. He went back to the bar and finished his water, and when Denny Pruitt shoved his boot toward Nora's direction a second time, Elias turned on his stool and said, clearly and without particular heat, "Do that again, and you and I are going to have a problem." The room went quiet the way rooms do when the temperature changes. Pruitt looked at him with the slow, uncertain calculation of a man who was drunk enough to be aggressive, but sober enough to assess a potential consequence. Elias was still seated, which should have made him seem less threatening. It did not. He was very large and very still, and there was something in his face that was neither angry nor frightened. It was simply settled, the way a man looks when he has already decided how something is going to go. Pruitt turned back to his cards without another word. The room exhaled. From the corner, Nora watched, her brush still in her hands, her amber eyes unreadable. Floyd set a fresh glass of water in front of Elias without being asked. The shoe was replaced by late afternoon. Elias walked back to the livery, checked Cinder's hoof, paid Tomas, and stood in the street for a moment in the long orange light of a New Mexico evening. The shadows were stretching themselves thin across the red dirt, and the air smelled of dust and mesquite, and the faint ghost of a rain that had not come. He had planned to keep riding south toward Las Cruces, where a friend named Rafe had offered him work on a cattle operation. He had a road to be on, and a reason to be on it. He rode past the Copper Bell on his way to the edge of town. The evening was beginning to fill with sounds. The piano had started inside, a few voices carrying out through the open doors. He slowed Cinder to a walk without fully deciding to, and through the window he could see the bright dresses moving and the laughter being performed, and in the corner, now sweeping instead of scrubbing, the woman with the braid. He kept riding. He made it almost to the edge of town, to where the road curved south and the buildings gave way to open scrubland, and then he stopped. He sat on Cinder in the failing light for a long time. Then he turned around. He was not a man who acted on impulses without thinking about them, and he thought about it very carefully, which is to say, he thought about her eyes and the way she had flinched and the bruise on her cheek and the fact that she had said nothing when she was pushed, because she had learned that saying something made no difference. And he thought about how she had looked at him when he crouched down to her level, with that watchful, guarded, half-hopeful quality that a person gets when they have been waiting a very long time for something to be different, and not quite believed it would be. He rode back into Dusthaven and took a room at the single guest house the town offered, a place run by a widow named Mrs. Aldridge, who served supper at 6 and expected quiet after 9. He told himself he was only staying one more night, because the road to Las Cruces was long, and he had been riding for weeks. He told himself this with the private knowledge that he was not entirely sure it was true. He ate supper at Mrs. Aldridge's table with 2 traveling salesmen who talked about railroads, and then he walked to the Copper Bell, not to drink and not to sit with Clara or any of the others, but to sit at the bar and read the room and see if Nora was still there. She was, moving between tables with a tray of empty glasses, her braid now fully undone so that her dark hair hung loose to her shoulders, and she had a smudge of something on her chin, and she moved with the efficient, unself-conscious purpose of someone who has never expected to be watched. He stayed for an hour. He did not speak to her again that night. He just sat at the bar and read the room, and noted that 2 different men ignored her when she asked them to lift their elbows so she could wipe the table, and that the owner, a thin man with restless hands named Holt, spoke to her the way people speak to furniture, addressing outcomes rather than people, never looking at her directly. He noted that she never raised her voice and never cried and never asked for anything, and that all of this had the practiced quality of a very old habit. When he left, she was carrying a crate of bottles to the back room, and she glanced at him as he passed and then looked away. And he thought that maybe she had been aware of him the whole time he was there, which meant she had been watching, which meant something. He was not sure exactly what, but something. He lay in his room at Mrs. Aldridge's and stared at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning, he had breakfast, paid for another night, and went to find Nora. He found her at the town well, hauling water in 2 heavy buckets, one in each hand, her arms taut with the effort and her jaw set. She saw him coming, and she stopped and waited with a kind of careful neutrality, as though she had not quite decided yet whether he was going to be a problem. "Let me take one of those," he said. "I've got them," she said. "I know you've got them," he said. "I'd like to take one anyway." She studied him for a beat, then held one out. He took it, and they walked in the direction of the Copper Bell side by side without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. "You're still here," she said finally. "I am," he agreed. "Your horse is fixed." "He is." She glanced at him sideways. "So why are you still here?" He considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, and then said, "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I expect I'll know soon." She made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." They reached the saloon's back door, and she took the bucket back from him and carried both inside. and he stood in the alley for a moment before going back out into the street. He found out pieces of her story in the way you find out pieces of anything in a small town, slowly, from different angles. From Floyd, he learned that she had come from a failed homestead 60 miles east, that her father had died of fever the previous winter, and her mother had died years before that, and that she had arrived in Dusthaven with nothing but the clothes on her back and a very small amount of money that had not lasted long. From Mrs. Aldridge, who knew everything about everyone and was willing to share a reasonable portion of it, he learned that Nora's last name was Hale, that she was 23 years old, and that she had turned down at least 2 offers of a different kind of employment at the Copper Bell, which Holt had not been entirely gracious about. From Nora herself, over the next several days, he learned the rest, not all at once, not in a flood, but in the careful way she parceled out information, testing each small truth before offering the next one, like someone crossing a frozen river who tests each step before trusting their weight to it. He learned it at the well in the mornings, and on the front steps of the saloon during the midday slow hour when she sometimes came outside to eat whatever food she had, and once at the dry goods store where they happened to arrive at the same time and spent 20 minutes pretending to examine flour and coffee while actually talking. She was sharp. That was the thing that surprised him first, though it should not have. He had seen it in her eyes from the beginning. She was quick-minded and direct, and she did not perform anything, did not soften her words to make them easier to hear or make herself smaller to make him more comfortable. She said what she thought, and she thought a great deal, and she had the kind of humor that was dry and quiet and easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. He paid attention. On the 4th day, he found her sitting outside the saloon with a small book open in her lap, and he sat down beside her on the step without asking, and she moved over slightly to make room without looking up, which felt like progress of some kind. "What are you reading?" he asked. She tilted the cover toward him. It was a battered copy of a natural history book, the kind with detailed engravings of birds and plants. "Floyd found it in a room a traveling man left behind," she said. "I've read it 4 times. Do you read a lot?" "When I can get books." She turned a page. "There aren't many to get." "What would you read if you could read anything?" She considered this with the focused attention she brought to everything. "History," she said. "I want to know how things came to be the way they are, and maps. I would look at maps for a very long time." "Maps," he said. "So I could see where things are," she said, as though this were obvious. "So I could know that the world is bigger than this." He looked at her then, at the side of her face, the strong jaw, the low dark brows, the amber eyes moving across the page, and something in his chest settled into a new arrangement, like stones finding the configuration they were meant to be in. "It is," he said. "The world is much bigger than this." She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Tell me about it," she said. So he did. He told her about the Colorado mountains in September when the aspens turned and the whole world went gold. He told her about the wide, flat pan of the Texas desert at night when the sky was so full of stars it looked solid. He told her about a river he had camped beside in the New Mexico high country where the water ran cold and clear from snowmelt, and you could see every stone on the bottom. He talked, and she listened, and she asked questions, real questions, not polite ones, questions that showed she had been thinking about what he said and wanted to know more, and the slow hour of the afternoon passed without either of them noticing. When she finally stood to go back inside, she paused with her hand on the door and said, without looking at him, "You're a better talker than you seem like you'd be." "Is that a compliment?" he asked. "It might be," she said, and went inside. He sat on the step for a while after that, smiling at the dusty street with no one there to see it. There was, of course, the matter of the town itself. Dusthaven had opinions about Nora Hale, mostly unspoken but very present, of the kind that accumulate when a woman is young and alone and in a position that requires her to be grateful for what she has. The women of the town, the respectable ones, the wives and the daughters, kept a careful distance that was not quite cruelty but was not kindness either. She was associated with the saloon, which put her on the wrong side of a line that the town maintained with considerable energy. Never mind that she did not do anything the respectable people feared she did. The men at the Copper Bell treated her as part of the furniture, something to be used and ignored, and occasionally pushed aside. Nobody had bothered to learn that she was the most interesting person in Dusthaven. Nobody had bothered to look. Elias had been there a week when he witnessed the thing that made him understand the full shape of what her days were like. He had come into the Copper Bell mid-morning, when the place was mostly empty, and found two of the saloon girls, Clara and a younger one named Bessie, standing with a third woman, a merchant's wife named Mrs. Corbett, near the door. They were not being cruel in any overt way. They were simply talking among themselves, and Nora had come through the room carrying a mop, and Mrs. Corbett had said something to Clara in a low voice, and then all three of them had laughed, a quick, dismissive laugh, the kind that is specifically designed to be heard. Nora had not stopped walking. She had not reacted, not visibly, not even a tightening of the jaw. She had simply moved through the room and through the door at the back, and she had disappeared, and it was only the way she disappeared, deliberately, efficiently, like something practiced over and over, that told him how much it cost her. He left the saloon and went around to the back and found her in the alley, standing very still, her hands flat against the outside wall of the building, her head bent. She was not crying. He did not think she cried easily. She was just standing, absorbing something. "Nora," he said. She straightened and turned around, and her face was composed again already, the shutters drawn back down. "It's nothing," she said. "It's not nothing," he said. "You don't have to tell me it's nothing." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not collapsing, but opening, very slightly, like a door easing off the latch. "They've always done that," she said. "Women like that. Even before, even when I was a girl, people looked through me like I was made of glass. My father used to say I wasn't made for pretty, I was made for lasting." She said it without self-pity, just reporting a fact. He meant it kindly. I always believed him. She paused. "Most days I still do." "Your father was right," Elias said. "And those women in there, they're made for one season. You're made for the whole year." She stared at him. "That's the strangest compliment I have ever received." "Do you think it's wrong?" She looked down at her hands, still holding the mop handle. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think it's wrong." He reached out and gently took the mop from her hands and leaned it against the wall. "Come and walk with me for a while," he said, "if you can." "I have work to do," she said. "You have been working since before dawn," he said. "I watched you carry water at first light, and I have seen you in that saloon every time I have come in for 6 days. You are allowed to walk for 20 minutes. She looked at the mop against the wall, and then at him, and then she said, 20 minutes, with a firmness that suggested it was non-negotiable. They walked the length of the town and back, and they talked about her father, who had been a schoolteacher in Ohio before something had driven him west. She was not entirely sure what, some loss or restlessness she had never fully understood, and who had filled the homestead with books and taught her to read from them before she was 5 years old. They talked about what it had been like when the homestead failed, when the drought took the crops and then the fever took her father, and she had ridden into Dusthaven on a borrowed horse with 42 cents and a grammar book and the specific quiet determination of someone who has already survived several things that should have broken them and has begun to suspect that maybe nothing will. "What do you want?" he asked her, and his voice was direct and honest, not challenging but genuinely wanting to know. "Not what you need. What do you want?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I want a house, not a big one. A real one, that's mine. With books in it, and a kitchen garden, and somewhere I don't have to be grateful for being allowed to exist." She said the last part with a quiet fierceness that he understood was something she had not said out loud before, maybe ever. "That's a very reasonable thing to want," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I would like to help you get it," he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. "Why?" He stopped too and met her eyes, and he did not look away. "Because you are worth helping," he said, "and because I want to." She said nothing, but something in her face was different when they walked back to the saloon, and she did not take the mop back inside with the kind of total absence that she had carried before. She moved through the afternoon with a small, persistent light somewhere behind her amber eyes, and when he came in at supper time, she brought his water without being asked and set it down in front of him and did not look directly at him, but her mouth was doing the thing where it was not quite a smile but was thinking about becoming one. He had been in Dusthaven for 10 days when he went to speak to Rafe by way of a letter, explaining that his arrival would be delayed by several weeks and apologizing. He did this at the small postal office that shared a building with the telegraph, and the woman behind the counter, who had heard everything about everything, raised her eyebrows at the Dusthaven return address but said nothing. He had also, by this point, had a straightforward conversation with Holt, the saloon owner, about the way Nora was treated. The conversation had not begun pleasantly. Holt was a man who had a very settled sense of how things were and did not appreciate them being examined. But Elias was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 220 pounds, and he had the specific quality of stillness that communicates more effectively than volume. And by the end of the conversation, Holt had agreed, with considerable reluctance, that Pruitt would be asked not to bother the cleaning girl, and that there would be no further suggestions about the other kind of employment. Nora did not know about this conversation for several days. When she found out, from Floyd, who could not help sharing useful information, she sought Elias out at Mrs. Aldridge's guest house during the morning, which was a thing she had not done before, and she stood on the front steps and said, "You talked to Holt." "I did," he said. "You didn't ask me first?" she said. "No," he said. "I should have. I apologize for that." She had clearly prepared herself for him to argue the point, and his apology seemed to catch her off balance. She stood on the step for a moment, recalibrating. "It's just, I don't need someone to fight my battles for me." "I know you don't," he said. "You've been fighting them yourself for a long time, and you've done it very well. I didn't do it because you couldn't. I did it because I was angry on your behalf, and because some battles shouldn't have to be fought alone, and because I wanted to." He met her eyes. "Are you angry?" She thought about it with the serious honesty she brought to everything. "No," she said slowly. "I wanted to be, but I'm not." "Good," he said. "Would you like to sit down? Mrs. Aldridge made too much biscuit this morning." She sat down, and they ate biscuits on the front steps of the guest house, and she told him about a hawk she had seen that morning when she was hauling water, circling slow and high above the flat desert to the east, and she described it with a precision and pleasure that came from the natural history book, and from a genuine, personal attention to the world around her, and he watched her talk with the settled certainty that was becoming familiar to him, the certainty of someone who has found something worth paying attention to and intends to keep doing so. There was a dance at the church hall 3 days later, the first social event of the season, organized by the Women's Association with the combined motives of fundraising and husband hunting that drove most organized social events in small western towns. The whole of Dusthaven attended. The saloon girls were not officially invited, which they navigated with varying degrees of graceful indifference, and Nora was in the category of not invited almost by default. She was not a saloon girl in the intended sense, but the association between her and the Copperbell was enough. She heard about the dance when a group of women came into the saloon to meet their husbands, speaking loudly about the preparations, and she went on wiping the bar with the particular blankness that was her defense against things that were not worth reacting to. Elias found her afterward and said, "There is a dance on Saturday." "I know," she said. "Would you like to go?" She turned to look at him with an expression that suggested she thought he might be teasing her. "I'm not invited," she said. "It's at the church hall," he said. "It's open to the town. I checked." "People like Mrs. Corbett will be there," she said. "Yes," he said. "They will." She looked at him for a long time. "If I go, they will look at me." "They will," he agreed. "They will look at both of us, and we will dance, and the music will be good, and at the end of the night it will not matter what they thought about it." Something moved across her face, fear, and beneath the fear, a wanting real and vivid. She twisted her hands together in the apron at her waist. "I don't have anything to wear," she said, and the admission cost her something. "Nothing that would be right for a dance." He nodded once. "I'll take care of that if you'll let me. As a gift. Not for any other reason than that I want to." She opened her mouth to refuse, closed it. He waited. She said finally, "I don't take charity." "I know that about you very well," he said. "This isn't charity. This is me wanting to see you dance." Another long pause. Then, quietly, "Blue," she said. "What?" "If there is a blue fabric at the dry goods store," she said, looking away. "I like blue." He went to the dry goods store the following morning and spent a long time talking with Mrs. Aldridge's daughter-in-law, who could sew and had opinions about what fabric suited what kind of woman, and they settled on a blue cotton lawn with small white figures woven into it, and by Friday evening it had been made into a simple dress that fit correctly, which was not fancy but was clean and pretty and right. He left it at the saloon's back door with a note that said only, "Saturday." He did not see her reaction. He only knew what it was because Floyd mentioned the next morning that Nora had stood in the back hallway holding the dress for a very long time and had not said anything to anyone, which from Floyd's tone was a remarkable event. Saturday came with the particular golden light of a New Mexico evening, and Elias put on the cleanest shirt he owned and ran a comb through his hair, which did not entirely improve it, and walked to the church hall at the appointed hour. The music had already started. A fiddle and a mouth organ, and a man with a washtub bass, and the room was full of people in their best clothes, moving through the figures of a square dance with varying degrees of success. He stood near the door for a few minutes, watching, and then he felt a shift in the room's attention, not dramatic, just a slight, collective adjustment, and he turned, and Nora was standing in the doorway. She was wearing the blue dress, and she had put her hair up. Not in the complicated style of the saloon girls, but in a simple, neat arrangement that left a few dark strands loose at her temples, and she was standing in the doorway with the stiff posture of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is committed to seeing it through, but is not yet certain of the outcome. Her amber eyes were moving across the room, and when they found him, she went very still for a moment, and then she moved toward him through the crowd with that efficient, purposeful walk that was entirely hers. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. "You look beautiful," he said, and he said it the way he said most things, directly, without ceremony, just the truth offered without decoration. She colored. It was the first time he had seen her color, and it moved across her cheekbones like something being released. "Don't say things like that," she said. "Why not?" "Because I don't know what to do with them." "You don't have to do anything with them," he said. "They're just true." He held out his hand. "Will you dance with me?" She looked at his hand, then at his face. Mrs. Corbett was across the room and had noticed her arrival with an expression that was working hard at being neutral and not quite achieving it. The other respectable women had noticed too. Clara was near the far wall talking to a man and had given Nora a single appraising look that held more genuine warmth than surprise. Nora put her hand in his. They were not the best dancers in the room. He was too large for the neat footwork that square dancing ideally required, and she had not danced in years and kept laughing at her own missteps with a real, unguarded laugh that he had not heard from her before. It was lower than he would have guessed and warmer than anything else she did, and it did something significant to the region of his chest. But they stayed on the floor for 3 dances together, and then 2 more when the caller changed the pattern, and by the end of the 3rd song, she was not stiff anymore. She was present in it, her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed from the movement, and she had stopped watching the room and started watching him, and he was watching her with the whole of his attention and not making any effort to hide it. Between dances, they went to the side of the room where someone had set out a table with lemonade and small cakes, and she ate a piece of cake with a genuine, uncomplicated pleasure that he found more endearing than he could have explained, and she told him that the fiddle player was hitting a note slightly wrong every 4th bar, and he listened and said she was absolutely right, and she looked pleased in a way that was not about being agreed with, but about being heard. Mrs. Corbett passed them twice, and each time found a reason not to speak. One of the association women, a kinder soul named Mrs. Reyes, stopped and asked Nora where she had learned to dance, which led to a real 5-minute conversation that left Nora looking slightly surprised and Mrs. Reyes looking like she had discovered something she had not expected to find. By the end of the evening, Dusthaven had not been transformed. Mrs. Corbett still had her opinions, and the invisible lines were still where they had been. But something small and real had shifted. A door had opened just enough to put a foot in, And as Elias walked Nora back to the copper bell under a wide sky scattered full of stars, she was quieter than usual, in a way that was not the shuttered quietness of someone withholding, but the full quietness of someone who has had enough to think about and is not yet ready to give it words. At the back door of the saloon, she stopped and turned to face him, and the starlight was doing something with the color of her eyes, making them seem very warm and very close, and she said, "Thank you." "It was a pleasure," he said. "I mean, for all of it," she said. For paying attention." She said the last two words carefully, as though they were fragile. "Nora," he said, "I don't think I could stop paying attention if I tried." She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then she rose up slightly on her toes and pressed her lips very briefly to the corner of his jaw, just below the scar, and then she opened the back door and went inside, and the door closed, and he stood in the alley under the enormous New Mexico sky for a long time with the warm pressure of that small, deliberate kiss doing something to the whole of his body that no amount of reasoning could address. He slept very well that night, which he had not expected. The next days opened differently. She was still careful. She was always careful. It was written into her by a long practice. But the carefulness had a different quality now, like a hand loosening on a rail when the ground below it is found to be solid. She sought him out in the mornings without a reason, and he came to the saloon in the evenings and sat at the bar not pretending to have a reason, and Floyd watched all of this with a benign satisfaction that he did not try to disguise. One evening, she sat beside him at the bar while the room was busy, and she told him about a dream she had had for years, not a sleeping dream but the other kind, of a small piece of land somewhere with good water, where she could plant things and have animals and maybe teach, if the district needed a teacher, which she thought it might because she had heard there was no school in Dusthaven and the children were growing up without one. She told him this slowly, feeling her way through it, half expecting him to be polite but non-committal in the way that people are when they find a thing too earnest to take seriously. He listened to every word and then said, "Tell me what kind of land." She blinked. "What?" "Tell me what kind of land you want, the specifics." So she told him. Not too flat because she had grown up flat and found it lonely. Somewhere that had trees, real trees, not just scrub. Good water, a spring or a reliable well. South-facing for the kitchen garden because her father had taught her that at least. Not too far from a town because she was not afraid of solitude, but she did not want to be stranded. She told him all of it with the focus of someone who has held something in their mind for a long time and never quite believed they would have cause to say it out loud. He nodded as she talked. "I've been through the country north of here," he said. "Up toward the foothills. There's a valley about 12 miles out, follows a stream down from the mountains. Trees. Good soil from what I could see. Some grass. Not claimed as far as I know." She stared at him. "You've been thinking about land up there?" "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, and his voice had a quiet directness that was different from his usual tone, closer somehow and more careful. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the bar. "Elias," she said. "Yes." What is this?" She gestured slightly with one hand, meaning all of it, the mornings and the conversations and the dance and the land in the foothills. "This," he said, "is me wanting to know if you would be willing to let me try to earn something from you." "What would you be trying to earn?" she asked very quietly. "Your trust," he said. "Your time. Eventually more than that if you wanted to give it." She was still for a long time. The noise of the saloon went on around them, the piano and the voices and the clink of glasses, all of it very far away from the two of them sitting at the bar. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. No one has ever," she stopped. "I'm not practiced at being wanted." "That's all right," he said. "Neither am I, much." He turned on the stool so that he was facing her directly. "I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. I'm only telling you that I would like the chance to ask, eventually, for a great deal." She looked at his face, searching it, and found whatever she was looking for because she let out a slow breath and said, "Then I suppose you can try." He smiled. It was a real smile, not performed, the kind that used the whole of his face, and she looked at it like she was taking note of something she wanted to remember. There was, in the weeks that followed, a great deal of trying. He came to the saloon and sat with her in the quiet mornings, and they talked about everything: history and animals and weather and the nature of people and what places looked like from a distance and what they looked like up close, and how those two things were rarely the same. He taught her to play a simple card game that she mastered in half an hour and then beat him at consistently, which she found satisfying in a way she did not try to hide. She taught him the difference between the tracks of a coyote and a fox, which she had learned from a book and confirmed by hours of patient observation, and which he found impressive enough to say so directly. He helped her when she would let him, which was not always, but became more often. He hauled water and carried crates and fixed a squeaking hinge on the back door that had been squeaking for months, and when she protested that these were her tasks, he said he was doing them because he had hands and spare time, not because she was incapable, and she accepted this distinction and stopped arguing about it. He also, carefully and without pressure, had a longer conversation with Holt that resulted in Nora being paid a small but real wage instead of the room and board arrangement that had been equivalent to free labor. And this time, he told her he was going to have the conversation before he had it, and she sat with the idea for a day, and then said, "Tell him I want $3 a week," which was a number she had clearly arrived at by thinking it through, and he said he would, and he did, and Holt agreed to $250, and she said that was acceptable. She moved out of the small, airless room behind the saloon's kitchen and into a room at Mrs. Aldridge's guest house, which was modest, but had a window and a door that locked, and which she approached with the careful reverence of someone for whom privacy and security had been abstract concepts for a long time. Elias had been in Dusthaven for 6 weeks when he rode north to look at the valley he had mentioned, taking a full day to do it properly. He came back sunburned and thoughtful, and he described it to her that evening with the careful detail of someone who wants to be precise. The stream, which ran clear over a bed of small stones, the grove of cottonwood trees along its bank, the way the land leveled off above the stream into a shelf of ground that would drain well and faced southeast, just as she had wanted. He described a structure that had been started and abandoned, just a foundation and part of one wall, stone laid cleanly enough to suggest someone had known what they were doing before circumstances changed. She listened with her eyes down and her hands folded in her lap, and when he finished, she said, "How much is the land?" "I need to check with the land office in Santa Fe," he said. "I've written to Rafe, who knows the territory better, but my sense is that it's homestead land." "Claimable," she looked up. "Claimable by a woman?" "The Homestead Act doesn't say only men," he said, "if you file as the head of household." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him, which was harder to do than it had once been. She said, "Would you want to claim it with me?" The question hung in the air between them, and she was looking at him with the steady, unflinching quality that was the bedrock of everything she was, not performing the asking, just asking it, clear and direct, and braced for whatever the answer was going to be. He said, "Yes, but I want to do it the right way." She looked at him carefully. "What is the right way?" "I want to ask you properly," he said, "when the time is right." Her breath caught, very slightly, and she looked away and then back. "All right," she said, and her voice was composed, but her hands were not quite still in her lap. "When the time is right." The time presented itself about a week later on a Thursday evening when the sky over Dusthaven went the particular deep violet of a New Mexico dusk, and the first stars were appearing in the east, and the air had cooled from the day's heat and smelled of sage and dust and something faintly sweet from the desert flowers that bloomed briefly after the rain that had come the previous afternoon. Elias had been to the land office by then, having ridden to Santa Fe and back in 3 days, and he had the information he needed and some papers in his saddlebag, and he came to the Copper Bell's back door at the end of Nora's shift and knocked, and when she opened it, she was still in her work dress with her hair coming down and a smudge on her chin, and he thought she was the most real and solid person he had ever stood in front of. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the edge of town where the road turned south, and the buildings stopped and the desert opened up, and the sky was enormous and full, and he stopped there and turned to face her, and she looked up at him with those amber eyes that had seen through every polite fiction and every performance and every surface thing from the very first day. He took her hands in both of his, and her hands were strong and calloused and small inside his, and he said, "I know that you didn't expect this, and neither did I, and I know that you have been careful, and I understand why you have been careful, and I know that you are the most self-sufficient person I have ever known, and you do not need me. But I want you to have me anyway, if you want me. I want to build that house in the valley with you. I want to learn everything you know about fox tracks and natural history and the history of things. I want to argue about maps with you and lose at cards to you every night for the rest of my life. I want to watch you become whatever it is you are going to become when nobody is pushing you to the back of the room anymore." His voice was steady, but his hands were not entirely. She could feel the slight pressure of them, not trembling, but alive, the way a thing trembles when it is held carefully. "Nora Hale," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment under the star-filling sky. Her throat moved. She said, "I need you to know something first." "All right," he said. "I will not be easy," she said. "I have been alone for a long time, and I have opinions about everything, and I do not ask for help naturally, and I will sometimes go quiet in ways that are not about you. And I am not. I am not made in the way that people expect women to be made, and I have known that my whole life, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise anymore." "I know all of that," he said. "I've been paying close attention for nearly 2 months." "And you want it anyway," she said. "I want all of it," he said. "Every difficult piece." She looked down at their joined hands, and then back up at his face, the dark eyes and the long hair, and the scar on his jaw, and the entirely serious, entirely settled expression of a man who has decided something and has no intention of undeciding it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He brought her hands up and held them against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat, and it was not as steady as his voice had been, and something about that made her eyes sting in a way that she did not fight. They were married at the leaning sheriff's office rather than the church, because neither of them felt strongly about the church and the sheriff. A practical man named Haverford was authorized to perform the ceremony, and did so with a businesslike warmth that suited them both. Floyd came as a witness and brought a flask of decent whiskey that he shared with no ceremony after the words were said. Mrs. Aldridge came and cried, which she seemed to find both embarrassing and non-negotiable. Mrs. Reyes came because she had genuinely taken a liking to Nora over the previous weeks. Clara from the saloon came and stood at the back and smiled with a real, unperformed gladness. Nora wore the blue dress. They did not have a wedding trip because there was too much to do, but the night they were married they sat outside Mrs. Aldridge's guest house under the stars and talked until very late, not about anything in particular, just the easy, winding conversation of two people who have chosen each other and are still slightly amazed by their own luck. And when Elias said something that made her laugh, the low, warm, unguarded laugh he had first heard on the dance floor, he thought very clearly that he could live for 100 years and never get tired of that sound. The work of building began in earnest the week after the wedding. They had filed the homestead claim together, with Nora listed as co-claimant, which required some creative interpretation of paperwork and some patient, firm conversations at the land office, but it was ultimately accomplished, and they rode out to the valley together to see it properly, side by side on horseback in the early morning when the light was sharp and clean. She saw the stream first, through the cottonwood trees, and she pulled her horse up and looked, and then she looked at Elias, and he was watching her instead of the water. "It's exactly as you said," she said. "Some things are," he said. They dismounted and walked the land together, measuring with steps and eyes and the particular knowledge that comes from growing up working close to the earth. The shelf of ground above the stream was better than either of them had described, the soil dark and deep, the grass thick enough to suggest reliable moisture. The foundation and partial wall of the abandoned structure were solid, built of the same red stone that lay scattered through the surrounding hillside. "Who do you think started this?" she asked, running her hand along the top of the existing wall. "Someone with the same idea as us," he said. She was quiet, her hand still on the stone. "I hope they found somewhere good," she said. "So do I," he said. Over the following weeks and into the summer, they built. Elias had experience with construction. He had worked on several buildings during his years moving through the territory, and he had the combination of physical strength and methodical care that good building required. He did the heavy work, hauling and setting stone, and he did it in the heat of the summer without complaint, his shirt dark with sweat, his arms working with a steady, powerful rhythm that was both efficient and entirely natural, the labor of a man who has never been afraid of difficulty. Nora was not a bystander. She hauled and mixed and handed materials and made decisions about layout and proportion with a confident practicality that came from having paid close attention to the homestead she had grown up in and what had worked and what had not. She also kept records, measurements and materials and what was needed, in a small notebook that she filled with the same precise handwriting she brought to everything. They also, during this time, fought. Not about serious things. The fights were the kind that come from two very strong-willed people learning to share a physical and emotional space, about where the kitchen window should go and how much wood needed to be cut before winter, and whether a particular stone was level, and they were quick and direct, and neither of them held on to things, which was the essential point. He said what he thought, and she said what she thought, and they worked through it and moved on, and both of them found this deeply satisfying in a way that was hard to explain. There was one fight that was not quick. It was about money, or rather, about the money he had and she did not, and the way that imbalance was arranged, and she did not want to be beholden, and he did not want her to feel beholden, and they were saying the same thing from different angles and could not hear each other because of where it was coming from. That fight lasted an evening and into the night, and it was resolved not with words, but with both of them sitting on the front step of the half-built house in the dark, and eventually Nora saying, "I'm afraid of needing someone," and Elias saying, "I know, I'm afraid of someone needing me and then leaving," and both of those things being true and old and not really about the money at all. They sat with that for a while, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had not done before, and he put his arm around her and held her against his side, and she felt the solidity of him, the warm, present, unmovable quality of him, and thought that maybe needing and being needed did not have to be the terrifying things they had always been. Summer deepened into the baking heat of August, and the valley was a mercy. The trees along the stream kept it cooler than the flat desert around Dusthaven, and the stream itself was cold enough for relief. On Sunday afternoons they rested from the building, and she read aloud to him from whatever books she had acquired. She had written to a bookseller in Santa Fe with her wages, and the results had arrived in a bundle that she had received at Mrs. Aldridge's with an expression of pure private happiness. And he lay on his back in the grass with his eyes closed and listened, and sometimes asked questions, and sometimes just listened, and she read with a pleasure and fluency that made it clear this was one of the most fundamental things about her, as essential as breathing. By September the house was standing, not finished, still lacking interior work in the full kitchen garden, but standing, roofed, with a door that locked and windows that opened, and a stone fireplace that Elias had built with particular care, knowing that the New Mexico winters could be brutal even at this elevation, and intending that it should work correctly for a very long time. They moved in on a Saturday in mid-September, which was nothing more ceremonial than arriving with their belongings on 2 horses and unpacking them. But Nora stood in the doorway of the main room with the afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows and making golden squares on the swept stone floor, and she was very still for a moment, and Elias came to stand behind her and said, "All right?" "It's mine," she said very quietly. "Ours," he said. She reached back and found his hand and held it, and they stood in the doorway of the house they had built, and the valley was green below them, and the mountains were dark blue to the north, and the sky was the endless, indifferent, beautiful blue of New Mexico in September, and the day was warm and still. "Ours," she agreed. The autumn was full and good. Nora planted the kitchen garden for the following year. Too late for this season, but she wanted to prepare the beds properly, turning the soil and enriching it, planning where each thing would go with the focused pleasure of someone with a very good spatial mind and a genuine love of organized growing things. She began visiting Dusthaven regularly and had, by way of Mrs. Reyes, made contact with 4 families who had children of school-going age with no school to go to. She began teaching at the church hall on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, using her own books and what materials she could gather, and the first day she arrived at the church hall to find 8 children waiting, some curious, some bored, one crying. And she stood in front of them and felt something in her chest expand that she recognized from her father's descriptions of his own work as vocation, the specific satisfaction of doing something you are built to do. Elias took the work that the territory offered. There was always work for a man of his capabilities and reputation, and he was careful and honest and delivered what he promised, so word traveled. He worked on a neighboring ranch through the harvest, and he helped build a windmill for a homesteader to the west, and he brought home what he earned, and they kept records together in Nora's notebook, and both of them paid attention to what was needed and what was not yet theirs and what they were working toward. They were working toward a few acres of cattle, enough for self-sufficiency and a modest income, not a cattle empire. They were working toward more books. They were working toward a school building separate from the church hall, which Nora had already begun talking to the town about with the polite but immovable determination she brought to everything she wanted. The first winter in the valley was hard, harder than they had prepared for in some ways, though they had prepared thoughtfully. The snows came from the Sangre de Cristos in November and did not truly relent until March, and there were nights when the temperature dropped in ways that made the stone walls of the house seem very thin. But the fireplace worked exactly as Elias had built it to work, and they had wood, and they had food put by, and they had each other, which was the thing that surprised Nora most. Not that it was warm in the way of 2 people sharing warmth, though it was that, but that it was interesting in a way she had not expected. She had feared that close quarters and constant company would produce a kind of friction that would wear them both thin. Instead, it produced something better, a deepening familiarity, the kind that comes from seeing someone in all conditions and finding that your regard for them increases rather than diminishes. He was not less interesting in small spaces. He was more interesting in small spaces. She learned that he thought best when his hands were occupied. He would be building or mending or working on something, and his mind would be working too, and he would say things that were the product of that combination of physical and mental engagement, observations or ideas that came out of nowhere and were often exactly right. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, quiet ones, and that he would lie still and wait for them to pass, and that when she put her hand on his back, he relaxed in a way that suggested he was glad she was there, even if he never said so directly. She told him that one morning, and he said, "I know. I should have told you myself." "Why haven't you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because asking for comfort isn't natural to me." "It isn't natural to me either," she said. "We're a pair," he said. "We are," she said. By the following spring, 1879 now, the territory warming again, the snow retreating up the mountains, the kitchen garden had its first proper planting, and Nora was teaching 12 children at the church hall, and the county had, under some pressure from Mrs. Reyes, and a written petition that Nora had composed and circulated, agreed to fund a school building that would be constructed that summer. Elias went to the planning meeting and sat quietly, while the men argued about location and cost, and when they had argued themselves into a circle, he said, "Build it here," and showed them on a map where the central point of the children's homes was, which was a thing nobody had thought to calculate, and they looked at each other and agreed. Nora heard this account from Mrs. Reyes and came home and told Elias he had good spatial sense for a man who usually pretended not to have opinions about committees, and he said he had very strong opinions about committees, which was why he usually stayed out of them, and she laughed. It was in the spring of 1879 that she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the early morning while they were drinking coffee at the kitchen table, not making a ceremony of it, just saying it clearly across the table and watching his face as he received the news. He went very still, the way he went still when something reached through all the layers to the place that mattered, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her and held her face in his large, careful hands and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, something between joy and reverence and an almost frightened awareness of how much he had to lose, all of it visible at once. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He stayed crouched beside her for a long moment, his hands still on her face, and then he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that in the morning light, and she felt the careful, enormous weight of his care and thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, to be held gently by something very strong. The pregnancy was not easy in the way they had hoped it would be. There were weeks in the summer when the heat and the illness together made her days difficult, and she was not a good patient, being resistant to slowing down and inclined to push through things that she should have rested through. Elias was patient and firm about this in equal measure, and they had several conversations that were technically arguments, but were essentially him saying that she was going to sit down and her acknowledging eventually that he was right, which did not come easily, but did come. He took on more of the physical work without comment, and he did not make it something she needed to feel grateful for, which was the essential thing. He made it a matter of course. He also drove her to Dusthaven for her visits with the doctor, a capable man named Torres who had studied in Santa Fe and had the confidence of someone who knew his work. And he sat in Dr. Torres's waiting room with his hat in his hands and his large frame occupying rather more of the room than it ideally would. And the doctor's wife, who managed the office, found him politely and entirely unmovable in terms of wanting to be told what was happening. The baby was born in January of 1880, a long, cold night when the stars were very bright through the bedroom window and the fire Elias had built at sunset was still going strong. And it was a boy, strong and loud and immediately, emphatically present, a boy who arrived in the world with the specific energy of someone who has decided they are not going to be overlooked. They named him Samuel for no particular reason except that both of them liked it, and they lay in the lamplight afterward with the baby between them. And Nora was exhausted and relieved and doing something with her face that was not quite crying and not quite smiling and was entirely beyond her control. And Elias was looking at both of them with an expression that had no name for it, something past love and past awe, something that was about the specific, staggering fact of being trusted with someone's life. "Hello, Samuel," Nora said to the baby, who had stopped crying and was simply existing with great intensity. "He looks like you," Elias said. "He looks like a very angry old man," she said. He laughed, and the baby startled at the sound, and then seemed to find it acceptable, settling again. And all three of them were in the house in the valley with the mountains dark outside and the fire going, and the night was very cold and very quiet and very full. Spring came again, and Dusthaven got its school building, and Nora went back to teaching when Samuel was 3 months old, bringing him with her in a sling that she had made, and that generated a great deal of comment from the women of the town, mostly positive and occasionally not, which she received with equanimity. The school building was small but proper, with 4 windows and enough desks for 20 students, and she stood in it on the first morning it was used and ran her hand along the top of the nearest desk with the same quality of gesture she had used at the house. "This is mine, this is real, this is something I built." Elias came to the opening of the school, which was not a ceremony so much as a collection of people standing around, looking at a building that had not previously been there. And he stood at the back with Samuel in his arms, the baby enormously unimpressed with the proceedings, and Nora stood at the front and spoke about what the school was going to be and what it was going to do, and she spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who has stopped waiting for permission. And Elias watched her and felt something he could not have articulated precisely, except that it was the satisfaction of watching someone become what they always should have been. Mrs. Corbett was there, and she did not say anything cutting, which was a development that both of them noticed without remarking on. The years that followed had the specific texture of a life that has been built rather than received. Not easy exactly, because nothing built is easy, but deeply satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when you understand why they are hard and what the hardness is for. There were difficult years and easy ones. There was a drought in 1881 that required careful management of the stream and the garden, and a season of discipline that was unpleasant but manageable. There was a year when 2 of the cattle sickened, and they lost what they could not afford to lose and had to rebuild patiently. There was the winter when Elias was injured on a neighboring ranch. A timber he was helping raise came down wrong, and he spent 3 weeks with a broken wrist and a bruised pride, and Nora managed everything without visible difficulty and made him rest, which he found more difficult than the injury. "You are the worst patient I have ever encountered," she told him during the second week. "You are the second worst," he said. "I got better," she said. "Under protest," he said. "Under reasonable protest," she said. There were good years too, many of them. The kitchen garden became something to see, the kind of garden that tells you everything about the person who keeps it, organized and generous and intensely alive. The school grew to 18 students. Samuel grew into a child who had his mother's eyes and his father's build and the particular stubborn intelligence of both of them, which made parenting him an exercise in staying 3 moves ahead. Nora got her maps. A traveler passing through, a surveyor with a collection he was willing to part with for the right price, sold her 3 detailed maps of the New Mexico territory, and she had them framed and hung them on the wall of the main room. And she spent a significant portion of a Sunday afternoon looking at them with an expression of deep, uncomplicated happiness. "You look like Samuel on Christmas morning," Elias said. "This is better than Christmas morning," she said, without turning from the maps. He came to stand beside her and looked at them, the fine lines of mountains and rivers and the spread of the territory, and then at her face. "Tell me where you'd go," he said, "if you could go anywhere." She studied the maps for a moment, then pointed. "Here, the high country, where the water comes from." "We could go," he said. She looked at him. "With Samuel. He's almost 4. He can ride." She looked back at the map and then at him, with the particular quality she had developed over the years, not the wariness of the early days, but something better, something that was about choosing, consciously and daily, to trust what she had found trustworthy. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They went that summer, a week in the high country north of the valley, camping along a clear running stream at an elevation where the air was different, lighter and colder and smelling of pine and stone, and the stars at night were so close it seemed impractical. Samuel, who had his father's physical fearlessness and his mother's observational intelligence, cataloged every animal track he found and reported his findings to both parents with great seriousness. Nora sat by the stream in the evenings and was quiet in the good way, the full way, and Elias sat beside her and was the same. On the third evening she said, "I think about what it was like before, at the saloon." He looked at her. "Do you think about it often?" "Sometimes," she said. "I think about how small it was, not just the room, what they expected of me, what I expected of myself." She was quiet for a moment. I'd gotten so used to being pushed to the back that I had started to think that was where I belonged. "You never belonged there," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I think I always knew, somewhere. It just—" She paused, looking at the stream. "It takes a long time to remember something you've been told to forget." He reached out and took her hand, the way he had taken it 1,000 times, easily, naturally, as though it were the most ordinary gesture in the world, which it had become, and which she loved precisely because it had become ordinary. Because the ordinary was what she had wanted, what she had always wanted, not the exception, not the performance, not being noticed for a single evening and then forgotten. The daily, consistent, serious, joyful ordinary of a life with someone who had looked past every bright and practiced thing and seen her and chosen her and kept choosing her. "I didn't push you to the back," he said. "No," she said. "You walked straight to me." "I did," he said, "and I would do it again." "I know," she said. The fire was burning low, and Samuel was asleep in the tent, and the mountains were dark all around them, and the sky was full of stars. And she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the stream in the high country of New Mexico in the summer of 1882, 4 years from the day he had ridden into Dusthaven on a horse with a thrown shoe and walked into a saloon and looked past everything that was supposed to be looked at. She was expecting their second child by the autumn, which she told him at the kitchen table again, with the same directness, and he received it the same way, the stillness, and then the hands on her face and the forehead against hers. This time, she was not as ill in the summer, and she taught through the fall and slowed down somewhat grudgingly in December, and the baby was born in February of 1883, a girl with Elias's dark hair and Nora's amber eyes, who arrived with the same emphatic energy as her brother, and immediately made clear that she intended to be heard. They named her Clara, which made Elias raise an eyebrow, and Nora said simply that Clara had smiled at her the night of the dance, and sometimes a thing did not have to be more complicated than that. Clara grew up to have an excellent smile and a talent for horses, and the particular gift of moving through a room in a way that made people want to turn and look, which she had entirely from her father, and which she deployed with an ease that suggested it was a tool rather than a vanity. Samuel, who was 3 and considerably opinionated about the new arrival, spent several weeks treating his sister with the careful suspicion of someone who has been told a thing is wonderful and is not yet convinced. And then one afternoon, Nora found him sitting on the floor beside the cradle, talking to the baby in a serious, low voice, explaining in considerable detail what the valley looked like from the higher ridge, and after that he was entirely won. Dusthaven changed around them over the years, the way small towns in the territory changed, sometimes better, sometimes worse, always moving. The railroad came within 40 miles in 1883, which brought new people and new money and new complications. A second saloon opened and then closed. The church got a new minister who was more interested in community than in condemnation, which Nora approved of and said so. Mrs. Corbett's husband passed in 1884, and Nora brought food to the house and sat with Mrs. Corbett for an afternoon, and Mrs. Corbett held her hand and said, "You are a better woman than I gave you credit for." And Nora said, "You are too," which was a more generous thing than it needed to be and was entirely characteristic. Floyd retired from the Copper Bell in 1885 and came to live in the valley as a neighbor on a modest piece of land to the east, because he had reached the age where saloons were less interesting than proximity to people he liked. He was a good neighbor, helpful and undemanding, and Samuel adopted him as a kind of honorary grandfather with the same decisive certainty with which he approached all his important attachments. Holt sold the Copper Bell in 1886 and left Dusthaven for reasons that were not entirely clear and that nobody much mourned. Clara, the original Clara, the saloon girl, had married a rancher from the south of the territory 2 years earlier and had written to Nora to tell her so, a letter that Nora kept because it was one of the first letters she had ever received that was simply, with no agenda attached, warm. The school grew. By 1887, it had 24 students and required a second teacher, which Nora found in a young woman from Santa Fe named Miss Arguello, who was quiet and brilliant and managed the younger children with an inspired serenity that Nora found both admirable and slightly baffling. The two of them became friends of the kind that are formed between people who have a shared project and a shared standard of what a thing should be, and their discussions about education and the children and the territory were some of the best conversations of Nora's adult life, not excepting her conversations with Elias, who had a different kind of excellence. In the spring of 1888, they planted the kitchen garden for the 9th time, and Nora stood at the edge of it in the early morning with her coffee, as she had done every spring, looking at the turned dark earth and the small precise markers indicating what went where. And Samuel was 12 by now and had been assigned a section of the garden as his own project, which he approached with his father's systematic energy. And Clara was 5 and had strong opinions about the flowers, which Nora humored more than was strictly logical. Elias came out of the house with his own coffee and stood beside her and looked at the garden, and then at the valley and the stream and the mountains beyond, the same view they had looked at together since the first autumn. And it was still worth looking at. It was still every day worth looking at. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Beans," she said, "and where I want the squash this year." "Is that all?" She looked at him, and her amber eyes were warm in the morning light, and the years had done nothing to them except deepen the warmth, and her face had the quality of a face that has been lived in fully and honestly, the lines of expression rather than the lines of careful suppression. "No," she said, "that's not all." "What else?" She considered. "That we were supposed to be a temporary thing," she said. "You were supposed to be passing through." "I was," he said. "Cinder threw a shoe at exactly the right time," she said. He smiled. "That horse always did have good judgment." She laughed, low and warm, and he felt it the way he had always felt it, the way he suspected he would always feel it, a specific, irreducible happiness, the kind that is not dramatic but is constant, and is in its constancy the most valuable thing a person can have. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and they stood at the edge of the kitchen garden in the spring morning, while the valley came alive around them, the birds moving in the cottonwoods, and the stream catching the early light, and Clara's voice beginning inside the house, talking to someone or to no one, as she often did. And somewhere the sound of Samuel, already up and doing something industrious in the barn. It was not the life that anyone in Dusthaven would have imagined for the girl who swept the back corner of the Copper Bell. It was not the life she had fully believed, on the worst of those days, was something she was allowed to have. But it was exactly, precisely, in every specific and particular detail, the life she had described on a front step one afternoon, to a man who had crouched down to her level and asked what she wanted. Not what she needed, not what she could settle for, but what she wanted. He had listened. He had remembered. He had helped her build it, stone by stone, year by year, with his own hands and hers, in this valley with its clear stream and its cottonwood trees and its southeast-facing shelf of land, in this house with its working fireplace and its maps on the wall and its books on the shelves that lined the main room from floor to ceiling now. A library that had grown one volume at a time like everything else they had. The mountains to the north were still snow-capped and indifferent to the affairs of the flatlands, as they had always been and would always be. The desert to the south was still making dust devils in the heat. Dusthaven was still leaning slightly to the left, still figuring itself out, still more complicated and more human than it appeared from a distance. And in the valley 12 miles north, two people who had come from nowhere and from loss, and from the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone but from being unseen, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely corner of the most unlikely room, were standing at the edge of their kitchen garden in the spring morning, shoulder to shoulder, looking at what they had grown. Samuel came out of the barn with a bucket and saw them there and did not disturb them, in the instinctive way children understand when a moment belongs to someone else. He watched his parents, his mother, small and solid and still, and his father, large and steady and always slightly closer to her than strictly necessary. And he thought what children think when they are old enough to see something clearly and young enough to simply accept it as the shape of the world, which was that this was how things were supposed to be. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house with her dark hair unbrushed and her eyes still full of sleep, and she said, "Is there food?" "In a minute," Nora said, without turning. "Papa," Clara said, "is there food?" "There is always food," Elias said, also without turning. "In a minute." Clara considered this and found it acceptable and went back inside. Samuel picked up his bucket and went back to whatever he had been doing. The morning continued its unhurried expansion, the light strengthening from gold to white, the air warming by degrees, the valley opening like something that had been waiting. Nora turned her face up to Elias, and he looked down at her, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing said for an audience because there was no audience. It was just the two of them, the way it had been since the beginning, and the way it would go on being. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "You already have coffee," he said. "I'll make more coffee," she said, "and then we'll plan the beans." "And the squash," he said. "And the squash," she agreed. They went inside together, and the door of the house in the valley closed behind them, and the morning went on, wide and unhurried and full, as mornings do when they belong to people who have earned them.